Well, it's hard to believe that we are coming close to the end of our Game of Stones series. We've spent our whole summer working through the 10 Commandments, and we find ourselves this morning at the 10th commandment, although, as somebody pointed out to me this morning, we actually haven't done all 10. We missed the thou shalt not steal, and we are going to go back to that one next Sunday. Now, you may be wondering, why are we leaving that one till the end? And we were actually intending to do it as part of our Summer Kids Week Sunday, but decided that we were going to shift that around a little bit. So although our order is not going to be correct, we'll have all of the commandments taken care of. So next week we'll be doing that one. I should mention that if you happen to have missed one of those, we've had some great messages, some great Sundays, and all of those, of course, are available on our website to download to your iPod or your MP3 player. Well, you know, the year was 1958, and there was a toy invented that was about to become the first really big fad to sweep across North American culture, and all of the kids just had to have one. Anybody know what it was? Can you guess? The hula hoop. That's absolutely correct. Between January and October of 1958, there were over 100 million hula hoops that were sold. And interestingly enough, shortly after that, sales just plummeted because Wham-O was finally going to introduce their latest and greatest toy, which was this plastic flying disc called a Frisbee. So tell me, why do you think that so many people wanted a hula hoop? Well, simply put, everybody wanted one because everybody else had one. I mean, it was one thing to have, it was another thing to actually do. And it's interesting to think about what has come and gone out of the decades since that hula hoop. In the 60s, we needed lava lamps, mood rings, and bell-bottoms. In the 70s, we had to have this new thing called a CB radio, Play-Doh, and those wonderful 8-tracks. In the 80s, we couldn't go without that Atari computer game system, a Rubik's Cube, Chia Pets, and if you had a little girl in the mid-80s, they just had to have one of those cute Cabbage Patch dolls. Well, in the 90s, we couldn't wait to get that Tickle Me Elmo or that Beanie Baby. And you weren't a real Christian unless you were wearing one of those What Would Jesus Do bracelets. But then something happened at the turn of the century because we all grew up and our toys became a little bit more sophisticated. And we all had to have one of those new music players that was known as an iPod. And all the people in the know were saying that they'd never take off. They would never replace the cassette tape or the records, right? So tell me, why do you think that so many of these fads caught on? I think they catch on because there comes a point where we think to ourselves, I just have to have one of those. We just have to have what we think everybody else has. Kind of reminds me of this Dennis the Menace cartoon that I saw a while back. And it was a picture of Dennis looking at this catalog and saying, this catalog's got lots of toys I didn't even know I wanted. Or maybe it's more like the comic from The Wizard of Id, the one where a monk is putting up a sign in front of his church while a visiting monk watches, and the sign read, "Thou shalt not covet." And the visiting monk is looking at this brand new huge sign and saying, boy, I wish we had a signboard like that in our church. Well, you know, in a sense, the 10th commandment that we're looking at this morning is a reminder for us to continually be keeping a check on what we value most in life. The 10th commandment is found in Exodus 20, verse 17, and simply put, it says this. It says, "You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male or female servant, his donkey, his ox, his donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor." Now, maybe you're sitting there thinking, awesome. To my knowledge, I can't remember the last time I coveted my neighbor's ox or donkey. I got this one. Well, I'm sorry to break the news to you this morning, but this commandment probably hits home more to each of us than maybe all the other ones combined. We all struggle with this. The original word translated as covet is actually meaning either desire or delight, but it's with a bit of a twist. Because the word covetousness is actually referring to a desire gone wrong. It's referring to a longing for or even a panting after, something that belongs to someone else or something that we don't have but we want. According to the Hollins Bible Dictionary, it's referring to an ungoverned and selfish desire that threatens the basic human rights of others. My favorite definition of coveting that I came up with was simply put this way: the uncontrolled desire to acquire. But it's also important that we understand a couple of things about this commandment and what it is actually trying to say to us. Because the commandment is really focusing on two things. Firstly, understand that this commandment is targeting our hearts. The 10th commandment stands alone from all the other commandments for one important reason. In fact, it represents, in a sense, a major shift or a change from the previous 9. Because where the first 9 deal with behaviors, this 10th one is really focusing on what's happening here. It's focusing on our heart. In fact, in one sense, we break the first 9 because we have broken the 10th. This commandment hits us right in our motives because we're reminded that it's a coveting heart that actually leads to the breaking of the other 9 commandments. In fact, if you're able to follow this 10th command, you're likely able to follow the other ones. Let me give you a couple of examples of that. Because the first commandment says, "You shall have no other gods before me." A coveting heart would say, "I want this," or "I want that." And whatever I want more than God is in fact my God, right? So my coveting has led me to break the first commandment. The fourth commandment says, "Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy." A coveting heart says, "I want more and I'll work extra for it, even on the Lord's day." The Sabbath day becomes unholy to me because I'm greedy. So my coveting has actually led me to break the fourth commandment. The seventh commandment says, "You shall not commit adultery." My coveting heart says, "I want that man or that woman," and you cross a line that brings untold misery to your family and friends and yourself. My coveting heart has led me to break the seventh command. The ninth commandment says, "You shall not bear false witness." A coveting heart would say, "I want a better reputation than him or her." So we speak badly about another person and we ruin their reputation. My coveting heart has led me to break the ninth commandment. Do you follow that? You see, God knows that a coveting heart often leads to the breaking of the other 9. And he also knows that this command is really exposing the condition of our heart. And it's a huge issue with people all throughout Scripture. In fact, it's a huge issue with a lot of very godly people throughout Scripture. Adam and Eve coveted God's knowledge, and they sinned. Jacob's sons coveted their father's favor, and they ended up selling Joseph into slavery. Saul coveted David's popularity and lost his mind and then his kingdom. David coveted Uriah's wife Bathsheba and ended up taking her and killing her husband. Judas coveted money and betrayed Jesus for it. The Pharisees coveted Jesus' power and ended up crucifying him for it. And that list could go on and on and on. This was and is a huge issue. I like the way James puts it. He sort of captures it in a bit of a different way when he says in James 1, verse 14 and 15, "Each one is tempted when by his own evil desire he's dragged away and enticed. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, gives birth to death." So think about what that is saying. It's saying before a thief steals, he first coveted his neighbor's possessions, right? Before a man and woman ever give in to adultery, they have first coveted one another's spouse. Before the first word of slander is ever spoken, the gossip has coveted a neighbor's reputation. So the first thing that God is doing here is he's telling us that this commandment is targeting our hearts. But the second thing we need to understand about this commandment is that God is targeting our relationships. And we often overlook this in this commandment, but this commandment is not so much concerned with what we do, but it's concerned with what we think. It is less about action and actually more about our attitudes. It's not just saying, like some of the other commandments, you shall not, but it's much more specific than that. In fact, it says, you shall not covet your neighbor's house, or your neighbor's wife, or his servants, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. The focus isn't so much on the things, but it's on the relationship that you have with your neighbor. Even the language emphasizes relationships. Neighbor, neighbor, his, neighbor. And we don't capture this in our English translations, but in the original Hebrew that it was written in, the pronoun his actually appears twice more than is actually in our English translations. The reference is made to our neighbor 7 different times in this one verse alone. And we're being told that when we covet our neighbor's possessions, whether they're things he or she owns or relationships that they happen to cherish, then some really sinister things start to happen in our hearts, in yours and mine. You know, back in the time of Moses, coveting was seen as being so incredibly personal because it focused greedily on the property of a neighbor that was actually his share in the land that God had promised to his people. And it focused squarely on the condition of an individual's heart. Well, this morning I want us to take a look at an Old Testament story of someone who really struggled with this issue, and it ended up being their downfall. It's the story of Abraham and Lot. In fact, I really think that this story wraps the sin of coveting into a story that maybe we can all relate to, and it's found in Genesis 13. So the story starts off in verse 5 and 6, where we're told this. Now Lot, who was moving about with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents. But the land could not support them while they were staying together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to stay together. So we learn even in these first few verses that Abraham and Lot were traveling together, and it appears that they have the same problem that a lot of us have, and that's that they were way too wealthy. Kind of expected a little more of a chuckle from that one, but they were traveling together, and they had so many possessions and so many animals that in reality there just wasn't enough space or resources to support them both. Kind of too many clothes and not enough closet space, if you want to put it that way. So verse 7 continues, and we're told, and quarreling arose between Abram's herders and Lot's. The Canaanites and Perizzites were also living in the land at that time. So this had become such a big issue that everyone was fighting with everyone else for the use of the limited resources that they had. Kind of like what was happening in the bathroom this morning before you came to church, your family fighting over the space. So Abram and Lot said in verse 8, let's not have any quarreling between you and me, or between your herders and mine, for we are close relatives. Is not the whole land before you? Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I will go to the left. So Abraham, in this incredibly unselfish and uncovetous move, allows Lot the option of picking what portion of the land he wanted to have for himself. And it's kind of interesting to note here that Abraham, being the elder, had every right to tell Lot what to do and where to go. But instead, he chose not to exercise that right. He chose to let Lot decide. You kind of get the sense from Abraham here that he was starting to understand that he really didn't always need to be in control of his life and his resources in order to have what he needed to provide for his family. In fact, he was starting to learn the kind of contentment that can happen when you trust and leave things in God's hands. So the passage continues, and we're told in verse 10, Lot looked around and saw the whole plain of Jordan towards Zoar was well watered, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. So rather than just arbitrarily picking an area or flipping a coin, Lot does a little bit of land surveying, and we're told that he looked and he saw. And the area that he surveyed was this flat land around the Jordan River, and it was well watered. It was beautiful. In fact, in his own mind, Lot considered the land to be so nice that he compared it to the two most fertile places that he was aware of at that time, the Garden of Eden and the land that was right around the Nile River in Egypt. Lot already knew what the rest of the land was like. Though it could support life, living on any other part of the land was going to require a lot more work and a lot more moving around so as to not eat up all the grass in that one place for the livestock. I mean, if there was ever a situation, if there was ever a time when the grass was actually greener on the other side of the fence, this was in fact that time. So Lot chose for himself, we're told in verse 11, Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan and set out towards the east. The two men parted company. So Lot, being this wonderful nephew that he was, did the loving thing and took the land in the valley for himself. But what we soon learn is that Lot's covetous heart was not going to stay content with what he had. He was eventually going to feel as though what he had simply wasn't enough. He wanted more and more. In fact, he wanted more so much, and he wanted to work as little as possible in order to achieve that. Verse 12, Abram lived in the land of Canaan, while Lot lived among the cities of the plain and pitched his tents near Sodom. When Lot actually got down to the valley, he discovered that the natural resources that were there, the land and the grass, were really not the only things that were desirable for him in that area. There were two cities, Sodom and Gomorrah, that were very appealing to him. Now, the two cities actually offered him some things that he really wanted. Specifically, there were people there that he could do business with so he could increase his wealth even greater than it currently was. It also offered entertainment. I mean, as you can imagine, it gets pretty boring around the sheep and cattle all day. They offered prestige. He was a well-off guy, and the people of the city would likely show him respect and might even accept him as part of one of the movers and shakers of that community. The city offered protection, and think about this, because out in the field, Lot was unprotected from the raiding parties that might come through at any time. But inside the city, inside those walls, he had the added protection of a whole bunch of people standing together against whatever enemy might come. So likely for all of those reasons, we're told that Lot actually pitched his tent towards Sodom. He set up his tent in such a way, and this is interesting, that every morning when he woke up, walked out of his tent, do you know what the first thing he looked at was? The first thing he looked at was the city of Sodom. And in a sense, the things of Sodom actually became his life goal. He wanted to be part of everything that that city had to offer. And he set his heart on Sodom and the things of this earth, rather than setting his heart on the things of God. Verse 13, now the people of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord. And this is actually where Lot's story turns tragic. Because Lot's coveting of material goods opened him up to making this whole series of spiritual compromises. He either knew when he went down to the valley, or he would quickly find out what kind of people lived in that city. But apparently he was willing to put up with that in order to get those things that he wanted most out of life. Well, pretty soon those compromises just became his new way of life. And he was happy, at least he thought he was. I mean, business was good. The entrepreneur in him was happy and satisfied, and he had all the money, all the stuff, all the prestige, all the friends. He had the social status. He had everything that he could possibly want. There wasn't one thing that he would look at and say, I want that he wasn't able to afford. Well, a span of time passes, and the Bible doesn't record actually how long. It might have been months, it might have been years. We have no way of knowing that. But we're told that Lot's dreams for material wealth and for safety and for prestige all seem to have come true. He's now moved out of his tents, and we find him now living in the city of Sodom. And God was about to throw a huge wrinkle into his plans because God had actually grown tired and angry at the people of Sodom. He was mad enough, he had had enough of the sin of that city, that he was getting ready to destroy it. But because of Lot's relationship with Abraham, and Abraham's pleading for Lot to God, we're told that God sent some angels down to the city to actually get Lot and his family out before everything came crashing down. So if you turn over a few chapters to chapter 19, beginning at verse 15, we read this. With the coming of dawn, the angels urged Lot, saying, "Hurry, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, or you will be swept away when the city is punished." Verse 16 starts, when he hesitated. The men, or the angels, grasped his hands and the hands of his wife and of his 2 daughters and led them safely out of the city, for the Lord was merciful to them. So my question to you is this: why do you think Lot hesitated? I don't think it was because he doubted God's message. I don't think he doubted the fact that the angels were there to actually save him. In fact, if anything, Lot was probably surprised that God hadn't destroyed the city sooner. Now hear this, because what caused him to hesitate to leave the city was probably his desire to hold on to those things and those relationships that he had gained as being part of that community. He literally had to be dragged away from the treasures of Sodom so that he could be taken to a place of safety. And you know, when you think about it, it poses kind of an interesting question for you and I, doesn't it? Because I wonder, what is causing you to hesitate when God says for you to come or go or to do a certain thing? Are there things that we're holding on to so tightly that nothing will cause you to let go unless somebody drags you? We're told in this passage that starting at verse 17, as soon as they had brought them out, one of them said, again, the angels, one of them said, "Flee for your lives. Don't look back. Don't stop anywhere on the plain. Flee to the mountain, or you will be swept away." Verse 23, by the time Lot reached Zoar, the sun had risen over the land. Then the Lord rained down burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of the heavens. Thus he overthrew those cities in the entire plain, destroying all those living in the cities and also the vegetation in the land. But Lot's wife looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. So once again, the angel had gotten them successfully out of the city. He told them not to look back, but to run as fast as they could to get away from the destruction that was coming. And we're told that when the sun had risen over the land, that God actually rained down fire on the cities and destroyed everything that was part of that area. In fact, we're told that he destroyed the city, everything that lived in the city, and all the vegetation. That wonderful green grass that had originally drawn Lot to that valley in the first place. Kind of interesting, don't you think, that the very thing that Lot had coveted for himself ended up costing him more than he could ever realize. Lot had lost a lot more than just the grass in that destruction, though. Lot's wife just couldn't let go of all that she had as being part of the city, the finery, the clothes, the prestige. So in her inability to let go and her longing to hang on to it, she turned around and looked at Sodom once more. She likely didn't turn around out of curiosity like you would kind of expect a young child to do when they heard all that noise. She turned around because she wanted the pleasures of Sodom more than she wanted the rescue that God was offering her. She had her heart set on the earthly things. So God literally made her part of the earth. I'm not going to work through the rest of the story with you, but believe me, it gets even worse for Lot. By the time chapter 19 is finished, Lot's covetous heart was responsible for the loss of the respect and love of his daughters, and eventually he lost his own self-respect as well. The bottom line here is that Lot lost because he chose to set his heart on the things of the world rather than on the things of heaven. He just wanted more stuff. He wanted to be seen as successful. He wanted things that he thought could bring him satisfaction and pleasure. But in the end, all they brought him was pain and suffering. Lot's coveting destroyed him, and if it wasn't for the intervention of God's messengers, he likely would have lost his life too. Just before we close this story, I want to point out one other thing that happened after Abraham and Lot had separated, going back to verse 13 again. Because Lot had chosen the best that the world could offer back then. He chose the best land near the biggest city where he could make the most money. And you know what God ended up saying to Abraham after Lot left? Chapter 13, verse 14. The Lord said to Abraham, after Lot had parted from him, look around from where you are to the north and the south, to the east and the west. All the land that you see I will give you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted. Go, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I am giving it to you. Lot chose the best that the world had to offer, but God gave Abraham the best that he had to offer. After Lot had separated from Abraham, God made Abraham this wonderful promise. And the really tragic thing is, look what Lot could have been a part of if he had only stayed and found a way for everyone to share in the resources that were available. What a powerful and challenging story to you and I. And I wonder, are we ever guilty of that? Do our coveting hearts ever choose the material things of the world over the eternal blessings that God really wants to give us? Well, before we start thinking that this was just an Old Testament problem, understand that this was even a huge issue for the Apostle Paul. In fact, the New Testament word for coveting is the Greek word eputema. And it's usually translated as the word lust in English, but it's referring to a passion for something that is inappropriate. And the Apostle Paul in Romans says something quite incredible about his own struggle with coveting. And he says, in fact, that it was this commandment, it was commandment number 10, that made him stop and realize his own sinfulness and brought him to the point where he finally realized his need for Christ. And he talks about that in Romans 7, starting at verse 7. He says, what shall we say then? Is the law sin? Certainly not. Indeed, I would not have known what sin was except through the law. For I would not have known what coveting really was if the law had not said, do not covet. But sin, seizing the opportunity afforded me by the commandment, produced in me every kind of covetous desire. For apart from law, sin is dead. Once I was alive apart from law, but when the commandment came, sin sprang to life, and I died. You know, and as Paul is writing this, it's easy to hear that he's not just speaking in some vague terms here. He's saying, this was me. I was there. This was my struggle. Paul is saying here that until he really digested what the 10th commandment meant, that he would quickly declare to people that he kept all the commandments to the letter. He says in Philippians 3 that he thought himself to be faultless until he detected in himself a covetous heart. And the more he tried to stamp it out, the more it gripped him. What Paul is really trying to communicate here is that if we can't get a grip on this last commandment, we're going to find ourselves struggling with all kinds of evil desires. We're going to find ourselves struggling with the other 9 commandments. And you know, there are those who will spend their entire life wanting something that they will never have. They will never find peace and contentment in their life because they're looking in the wrong place for it. Paul doesn't leave us hanging, though, because he tells us how he overcame this. His solution was that he learned to be content in every situation. He could be happy with or without the goods of life, he says. In 1 Timothy 6, starting at verse 6, this is what he writes. He says, "Godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into this world. We can take nothing out of it. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that." People want to get rich, fall into temptation, and a trap into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge men into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many, many griefs. If you are chasing after the things of this world, my friends, you will be pierced with many griefs. You know, there once lived a man who all he ever wanted in life was more and more and more. He wanted more money, so he parlayed his inheritance into $1 billion pile of stuff. He wanted more fame, so he broke into Hollywood and soon became a filmmaker and a star. He wanted more sexual pleasure, so he paid handsome sums to indulge every one of his urges. He wanted more thrills, so he actually designed and piloted the fastest planes in the world. He wanted more power, so he secretly dealt political favors so skillfully that 2 U.S. presidents became like his pawns. All he ever wanted was more and more and more and more and more. He was absolutely convinced that more would bring him the true satisfaction that he hungered for. But unfortunately, history tells us something very different about this man. At the conclusion of his life, he was emaciated, he was colorless, he had a sunken chest, his fingernails were long and gross. He had rotting black teeth. He had tumors all over his body because he just didn't care anymore. He had needle marks up both of his arms from drug addictions. And Howard Hughes died, believing the myth of more. He died a billionaire junkie that never found the satisfaction in life that he wanted. And you know, the real problem that he had, and I want to suggest the real problem for a lot of us as well, is that we define success by how high a pile we can build, rather than how deep a soul we can develop. And Jesus said this in Luke 12, "Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. A man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions."